Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this PilieroMazza webinar, DOD and GSA Inflation Update. We're going to be providing some key takeaways for government contractors on how to address, or on the agency's latest guidance on how to address inflation in government contracts. I'm Kevin Barnett. I'm counsel here at PilieroMazza in the Government Contracts Group. I address all kinds of government contracts issues, focusing on claims, REAs, and terminations, and litigating other kinds of disputes before both the Court of Federal Claims and the Boards of Contract Appeals. With me today is Lauren Brier. Lauren, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon. I am the co-chair of the Claims and Appeals team alongside Kevin. I focus particularly in government contract disputes, REAs, claims appeals, also assist with termination proposals and disputes relative to the federal acquisition regulations. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
And while both Lauren and I are in the Government Contracts Group, PilieroMazza offers a full range of services, as we like to serve ourselves, position ourselves as a strategic advisor in both pronouncing words correctly and advising companies, government contractors, and commercial businesses alike across a number of industries where we can provide litigation, corporate, government contracts, and a number of different services. But today, we're going to be focusing on what has been the most consistent topic that clients have called me about over the past 6 to 9 months, which is inflation. We're going to cover the impact of inflation on government contracts. We're going to touch upon GSA's inflation guidance. We're also going to touch upon and talk more in depth about the Department of Defense's inflation guidance, which is going to include both an overview of their various guidance memos, as well as a summary of the Extraordinary Contractual Relief process, which is an old but not very often used mechanism to obtain relief. Finally, we're going to summarize all that for you and highlight some price escalation recovery and mitigation strategies. And to wrap it up, I'm going to offer some key takeaways. So in some ways, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, because no one knows more about the impact of inflation on government contracts than government contractors themselves. I'm just hearing about it second, sometimes third hand, how big a problem it is. But we can just start with, what is the level of inflation we're facing. The latest numbers have the consumer price index around 8.3% year over year. The producer price index is even higher, about half a point higher at 8.7%. And the difference between those, the consumer price index is really what the average consumer pays for a basket of random goods and services, whereas the producer price index is a better mark of how it's affecting government contractors, because it measures the prices actually paid by producers. I mean, it's divided by industry and by product category. So with those nearly unprecedented rates, we haven't seen rates in the 8s since the 70s. It's impacting government contracts in a number of different ways. It's driving cost and price increases to the government. It's affecting contractor performance. It's making government budget management difficult. It's impacting contractor schedules. It's starting to work its way into impacting acquisition strategy. And it's not confined to different markets or to particular markets, although each market is reacting differently. And that's something somewhat important to remember as we discuss EPA clauses in different. And with that in mind, it's important it's relatively easy. Most contractors do understand their markets, but it's also important that they can educate the contracting officer about their particular market. and how inflation may be affecting certain aspects of it, whether it's prices, costs, or lead times. The effect of inflation also depends on the type of contract. For firm fixed price contracts, the risk of inflation and the risk of loss due to inflation is generally borne by the contractor. Sometimes the risk is shared if there's an economic price adjustment clause or an EPA clause. But those are relatively rare. DOD estimated that only 5% of its contracts had a EPA clause, and that's consistent with my experience hearing from clients that very few of them have EPA clauses. If you have a cost type contract, the risk of cost increases is generally borne by the government. You're going to pass along those higher costs to the government. That said, inflation does not relieve a contractor or cost reimbursement contractor's obligation to make sure those costs are still reasonable. For GSA contracts and schedule contracts, the contractor, if faced with inflation, has some flexibility to increase its prices, take items off the schedule, or change its quantity requirements, or add new items to the schedule. And those contracts always include, or generally include, an economic price adjustment clause that's specific to the EPA. Then there were two things in the trade press, the government contractor trade press, in the past month or so that caught my eye as real world examples of how inflation is affecting. I guess infecting is a pretty good word there too. The government contracts. First, an Air Force acquisition executive said that they have started noticing new contracts that are, quote, significantly higher than expected due to inflation. So they've started noticing contractors passing along those cost increases to the government, which is what we'd all expect to see. There was also another relatively unremarkable GAO bid protest case that got decided earlier this month, or last month at this point. In that case, the Regal Press protested an award where they were the only company to propose a bid or to submit a bid for a contract at a GPO, the Government Printing Office. GPO rejected their bid because their price was unreasonable. They argued that GPO's their price reasonableness analysis did not adequately take into account inflation. Where GPO argued that they did their price reasonableness analysis, looked at historic prices paid, and then added a premium to account for inflation. And while GAO, as they normally do, sided with the agency, I think this GAO decision portends the continuing disconnect over what the government sees as a reasonable amount of risk that contractors should be accepting and what contractors are actually thinking they need to price into future bids in case to account for all the risk of inflation. So with that, let's get to our first deep dive into the agency's guidance. Lauren, can you help us understand what's going on in the General Services Administration?
Sure thing. So GSA issued two separate guidance distributions, the first one being issued in March 2022. The acquisition letter focused primarily on GSA schedule holders in a direct response to the impact of inflation and GSA contractors' ability to support federal agencies. They recognize that various factors continue to impact the global economy, has led to general shortages and delays, as well as price volatility. The most important part of the acquisition letter is that it placed a temporary moratorium on a number of limitations that were contained in certain GSA economic price adjustment contract clauses. Specifically, the policy moratorium relaxed time limitations on EPA increases. It relaxed the limit on the number of EPA increases a contractor may request. It also allowed a lower level of approval to one level above the contracting officer for price increases above the EPA cost ceiling. It also clarified that if a contractor had removed an item from their MAS contract, the contract officer may add the same item back at a higher price if the higher price was determined fair and reasonable. So it gave some more leniency to contractors. So we can move to the next slide. So after the March alert, a September alert was more recently issued, which highlighted several strategies for broader acquisition community to address inflation, primarily encouraging the use of EPA clauses. If the EPA clause is included, a primary consideration would be funding implications. So one of the big points was an EPA clause could be adjusted, but the government needed to make sure that there would, and still needs to make sure that there's funding available to support the EPA. Another recommendation that was set for was leveraging streamlined procurement vehicles to reduce procurement lead times. And then GSA also indicated that they recommended awarding shorter duration contracts. Multiple award schedules and IDIQs are often designed to reduce the time it takes to make an award. So GSA came out saying to maximize time savings, COs were encouraged to not apply FAR 15 procedures for buys or to unnecessarily complicate evaluation considerations, basically to move forward the procurement process to alleviate any impact of inflation. Some key considerations for using and developing EPA clauses that are now being encouraged by GSA through this guidance. Like I said before, you want to make sure that there's the appropriate funding available. You want to make sure that your EPA clause provides for upward and downward adjustments, not so it just benefits the contractor, but it's enticing to the agency as well through a downward adjustment. There's many different formats, and agencies have freedom to craft versions that meet specific contract needs. So, you know, again, this is an open negotiation. If there's certain terms that you think may be beneficial to both parties, that's something that the agency can consider when negotiating this type of clause. As another reminder, these clauses are often linked to market fluctuations and indexes. The index should always be monitored throughout performance and changed through a bilateral modification if it doesn't meaningfully represent the market condition as time moves forward. Increases may trigger other contract obligations, so just be wary of this, that it could trigger small business subcontracting plan requirements and other issues that may not be on your radar at the time of award, but could become an issue as performance continues. The alert also provided sample language that I'm going to run through as well. So we can move to the next slide. So like I said before, material tracking is extremely important when negotiating these EPA clauses, as they're tied to, you know, specific materials, the price per unit at award, and then making sure that you have a reasonable and relevant index that's being cited. The adjustment, again, should always have an upward and downward trigger value. The trigger percentage time period is also something to note, as well as how much time the contractor has to notify of any necessary adjustment. So what we've done is we've pulled out some samples, particularly from the GSA guidance. There's various examples in the guidance online. Right here, we have just pulled out one example that I'm going to run through at a high level. But if you have questions, I do recommend that you go to the GSA guidance to seek a further breakdown of these examples, or you can always reach out to Kevin and I, and we can talk through these in more detail. But the example that we're providing was pulled from the Appendix B of the guidance. The material that is being specified is lumber. They're identifying it as $1 board foot, which is the price per unit of measure at time of award. They're tying this to the producer price index, which is very common, which lists the commodity lumber wood, and it's the index monitor mechanism. The upward adjustment that's being identified here is 7.5% or over. That will trigger the upward adjustment, and then similarly for a downward adjustment trigger, that's a negative 7.5% or over. The trigger percentage time measurement is going to be every 6 months, and then the notification requirement is a monthly notification. And then the sample total line item amount is $100,000 for under a fixed price contract. Again, there are other examples provided in the guidance list. This is just one that we pulled out. But if if your contract doesn't really equate to this type of adjustment, I recommend again going to the guidance to see if there's a sample that better fits your situation. But using this information from Appendix B, GSA has then gone, we can move to the next slide. GSA has then gone and basically provided a sample scenario using those particular terms. So in this example, the contract was awarded July 1st, on August 1st, and monthly thereafter. Again, that is, it's a monthly determination as to when this would be triggered. Monthly thereafter, the contractor submits notification to the contracting officer regarding any change in the index monitor mechanism. Again, this is C on the previous slide. From July 1st to August 1st, the PPI for the commodity increased 0.08%. And then you'll see, I'm not going to run through each of these, but you'll see that it basically fluctuates. So there's an increase to 1.4, an increase to 2.5%, there's a decrease, and then 2 subsequent increases. The 6-month calculation total is 10.18%. So we do have a trigger. The unit price has increased 10 cents. So the dollar increased by 10.18%. There's an increase in the material price of 10.18%. The 6-month change is above the upward trigger amount, like I said before, which was 7.5%. The material represents 17% of the total line item price. So what you've taken then is you take 17% times the total line item, which if you look at the previous slide, it was $100,000. So we're looking at a total of $17,000 here. And this is the percent this material multiplied by the total line item amount. And again, the material is lumber here. So what you do then is you take the $17,000 and you multiply that by the 10.18% increase in the material price, which gives you $1,730.60, which is increase of the funded line item for the EPA. And again, I know that that is a lot of math and can be quite confusing, but I think comparing the 2 slides together provides a little bit more context. And again, I refer you back to the GSA guidance so you can take a look at additional sample applications. And again, Kevin and I are always here, to talk through this information, and any questions as that you have pertaining to EPA clauses you already have in your contract, or potential negotiations to include a particular EPA clause.
So that's what we're hearing when the questions, Lauren, somebody's raising that they heard our advice, they heard the advice before, but every time they go to ask a CO to add a EPA clause, they just say no. And I think that's a very difficult situation, because at the end of the day, the CO has the final word on which clauses get included in a solicitation. And we're hearing some conflicting guidance, because the GSA guidance is very clear that EPA clauses are helpful, and the DOD guidance that we're going to discuss specifically says that contracting officers should be thinking about adding EPA clauses. But I think we run into one of, or maybe all three problems where EPA clauses are a little unknown and contracting officers are historically reluctant to tread into water they haven't tread many times before. Two, they do come with some funding risk where the contracting officer needs to justify where the funding is going to come from. I have some ideas that maybe as we talk about extraordinary contractual relief later on, maybe that the contracting officer can use that mechanism to allow the addition of an EPA clause without the identification of funding. So that's an idea that I have to think about a little bit more. But there's no way to force a contracting officer to add the EPA clause. What, in an ideal world, I just blanked. In an ideal world that you can just raise your prices and present to the contracting officer that with an EPA clause, we can charge you $100, and without an EPA clause, we can charge you $200. The difficulty is, unless you illegally get together with everyone in the market and agree to do that, then you risk somebody coming in and saying, well, we'll take the $100 contract even without an EPA clause. And so with how thin margins are already in government contracts and how competitive the contracts are, I think unfortunately contracting officers are seeing that they can get away with having the contractor accept all the risk. And that's kind of just an unfortunate situation. And I'm not sure there's any way to make a contracting officer add a EPA clause if they're getting adequate submissions, adequate bids without it.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Kevin. I mean, there really, unfortunately, is no regulatory requirement, right, that a contracting officer actually add in an EPA clause. I do think, and I think Kevin and I have talked about this on the side. I mean, the guidance that's coming out from GSA and DOD is helpful, right? So if a CO, initially is unwilling, I think citing to this guidance, showing it to them and saying, well, GSA, Department of Defense, they're all encouraging their contracting officers to do this. I think that's helpful, but unfortunately, at this juncture, there is no regulatory requirement. I do think, we are going to talk about extraordinary contractual relief, which it's seemingly going to be providing some form of avenue for relief. But unfortunately, at this point, there is no regulatory requirement that we could present to a CO and say, well, hey, this is out here under the FAR and you have to include this. I think the better conversation is having an amicable discussion with them, presenting, the recommended guidance that's out there and seeing if they're more willing now that there's, something in writing that two very large agencies are putting out and encouraging their contracting officers to consider to provide some relief.
And along those same lines, the Defense Acquisition University has two really detailed, about 45 minutes to an hour each, free courses on exactly how to put together these EPA clauses, which could be helpful.
Right, agreed. Again, if the CO is willing and there is funding on the table, both of these online courses are extremely helpful to encourage that negotiation. And then, moving to the streamlined acquisition idea that GSA is touting. And this is just, again, going to the speed of the acquisition process, noting and recognizing that inflation is unwieldy currently. And so what they've done is they've come out and encouraging their contracting officers to utilize pre-existing procurement vehicles. And that includes GSA multiple award schedules, Oasis, 8A Stars, Vets 2, and Polaris. And then, like I said previously, encouraging the CEOs not to use FAR 15 procedures to buy against these vehicles, or really just anything that would unnecessarily complicate evaluation schemes, suggesting CEOs use oral presentations to address offer capabilities just to keep the process moving at a faster rate. Another, concept to consider when dealing prior to award, GSA is encouraging their contracting officers to consider reducing total periods of performance. This is intended to help contractors more reasonably predict costs. It also, would minimize the amount of risk bidding on a shorter period. And, very clearly longer contracts always pose a risk, especially in the firm fixed price context. And particularly with what we're seeing, out of the pandemic, and, as inflation continues to be a problem, it's harming competition and just harming the procurement process as a whole. So GSA is encouraging their contracting officers to consider shorter contracts, less option periods. So that is another point that has come out of the GSA guidance issued in September.
In a lot of
Kevin,
times,
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Lauren.
No, I was just going to kick it over to you.
Yeah, so I think a lot of times, and we were just talking about this, we've encouraged contractors attempt to influence the solicitation at the solicitation phase. Sometimes that's your only opportunity to influence the solicitation, so you take what you can get. But to the extent that you're responding to RFIs or market research questionnaires, and you can point out that you could accommodate lower pricing for a shorter term contract, or that you'd be interested in bidding on a 6-month contract and not a 10-year contract due to these risks, or that your price would be 70% lower, or you could provide a substantially lower price with an EPA clause than without one. I don't know this for a fact, but I just get the sense that contracting officers would be more willing to include it in the solicitation at that earlier phase when the solicitation was still being put together, and that sometimes when the solicitation is out on the books and then during the Q&A process you have contractors asking for EPA clauses to be added, the CO has a natural but inappropriate adverse reaction, like, no, this is how it's going to be. I've already put this together. So trying to get those requests in earlier for any of these, shorter duration, less complicated, quicker review times and EPA clauses might be helpful. In addition to GSA guidance that they've come out with, DOD has also provided a series of comments and guidance on the inflation issue. Dating back to the spring, DOD responded to some congressional questions about the impact of inflation. That was early May. I found those questions didn't get nearly as much coverage as some of the guidance memos, but they included some very telling statements, including that, one, DOD expected prices to go up because of inflation. More shockingly, that DOD expected companies to charge them higher prices in order to recoup their losses from prior contracts where inflation caused them to be less profitable. I was very shocked by that statement, and equally as shocked when DOD told Congress that they had not received a single request for equitable adjustment based on inflation. Fast forward about a month, at the end of May, they issued their first guidance memo. This memo basically had two parts. The first part said that contracting officers did not have the legal authority to grant REAs or claims based on inflation only. But as a small carrot to go with that stick, they did encourage contracting officers to use economic price adjustment clauses that Lauren just kind of explained in detail, if the contract warranted it. Same slide. That was really the topic of most of the summer. And then at the, just in time for back to school, DOD issued a new inflation guidance memo that tried to walk back some of the harshness of its first memo. In that new memo, it reminded contracting officers that they do still have authority to grant non-price relief with adequate consideration. So that could be schedule relief, that could be performance requirements or certain materials. It could also be to add an EPA clause or to add an EPA clause to future option years. And then kind of out of nowhere, almost like out of a GovCon textbook, the DOD also says that in certain circumstances, contracting officers could grant, or the agency could grant, extraordinary contractual relief as remedies for inflationary contracts, which kind of took everyone aback a little bit, because this is, it's a well-known remedy that allows the government to make contract adjustments, notwithstanding any other law, but it is used very sparingly and has been used almost no times in the past 15 years. So the fact they trotted that out was very interesting. However, the memo and the press related to that were very focused on that what DOD can do is limited to its available funding, and that they needed Congress to provide additional funding. There was some hope that Congress would provide additional funding as it, resolved the never-ending government shutdown discussions. However, September 30th came and went. The government passed a temporary continuing resolution, and it contained no relief for contractor inflation issues. So let's kind of break down what all this various guidance and discussion from DOD has actually highlighted for what options a contractor has to address inflation. So first, contractors can raise their bids. I think DOD's memo opened the door to raise the bids to reflect higher costs, to reflect future inflation risk, as well as to recoup losses from prior firm fixed price contracts affected by inflation. If you do go that route, I would be sure to document that's what you're doing, in case there's any audits or discussions about why your profit margin on this contract was so high compared to others, and you can point out what you'll have contemporaneous documentation explaining why. The obvious downside here is the higher you raise your price, the less competitive you're going to be. So I think that limits the effectiveness of this remedy, but I think it might have its place. The second option that these memos point towards, and as we discussed a little bit earlier, I think they point towards it very strongly, but that might just be strongly in theory, and COs don't seem to be backing that up with action, and that's adding EPA clauses. This is requesting the EPA clause at the pre-award stage, or even the market research RFI stage, and also asking for it to be added, because that's another remedy that these memos have pointed towards, that we can adjust the contract terms. Some contracts lend themselves to providing a change of contract terms. So, again, I talked about this a little bit in the last slide. Schedule relief, revised service levels, the types of materials. Maybe steel is particularly spiked, so there's a substitute or a particular style door, and then there's a substitute that accomplishes the same function without maybe the same aesthetic level. All of these are subject to adequate consideration, which sometimes can be the rub, but at least if the contracting officer is willing to work with you, this provides a really good avenue to come to some kind of agreement. There's also the REA claim route. Granted, the first DOD guidance memo specifically told COs to reject REAs based on inflation, but that first response to Congress said they hadn't even received any REAs based on inflation. So it's unclear how the COs are going to respond. And in addition to that, if you can somehow frame the REA or claim you can somehow frame the REA or claim as a change or a delay, then those inflation costs can be recoverable. In fact, I believe it's the GSA inflation memo that specifically references that if a government caused delay pushes costs into a period of higher inflation, that those costs could be recoverable. And we have a note from the audience that REAs for inflation have been submitted and rejected. I am very well aware of this. I'm just pointing out that DOD senior leadership continues to say that they have not seen any REAs for inflation, which is going to be an important point later when I talk about Congress, where one of my theories in reading between the lines on a lot of press that DOD leadership has given and the underlying memos that have been issued, DOD thinks there needs to be a congressional fix, but DOD largely lacks the quantitative data to go to the Hill and argue how much of a fix is actually required. But we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But no, I'm well aware that they have been submitted and rejected. Finally, another possible remedy that is not as familiar to the government contracting community, especially those of us who were not government contractors during the Carter administration, extraordinary contractual relief. The second DOD guidance memo specifically calls this out as a possible method for recovery. And going back to the point I just made about DOD needing data, in that memo, they set up a special email where required contracting officers who received extraordinary contractual relief requests to report it to the senior DOD leadership email box as soon as possible, within 10 days. And I think the reason for that is largely because DOD is just thirsty for data to try and go to the Hill and resolve this. So I wanted to kind of do a deeper dive into extraordinary contractual relief because it is not something that we encounter every day, and it's not something that we've seen in recent years. So let's go to the next slide. Extraordinary contractual relief, it's in FAR Part 50. It's also known as Public Law 85804, and it grants certain agencies or the heads of certain agencies to enter into, amend, or modify contracts without regard to other provisions of law related to making, performing, amending, or modifying contracts, whenever the president considers that such action would facilitate the national defense. Historically, this relief is granted very rarely. I was talking with some former senior acquisition officials at DOD, and they were saying that it was always, the building was always very hesitant to use this authority because it is such a almost like an unlimited sword they get to wield, because they're afraid that if they use it too much, that Congress would take it away from them. Next slide. So in essence, it creates this relief where the government gets to come in and help out a contractor when no other remedies available at law or equity. And there are three ways they can exercise this: through contractual adjustments, advance payments, or exercise of residual powers. And there are a number of agencies. We can go to the next slide and look at all the different agencies that have this authority. But I will say, I keep in mind that it was my encouragement of using this, or the likelihood of success goes up dramatically because DOD specifically called it out in their memo. And then when I say likelihood of success, that depends on a lot of different factors. It is still unlikely to be granted across the board. But while it's possible to submit these requests at all these other agencies, only the DOD agencies have this memo that kind of nudges them along. So I just wanted to kind of put that out as a qualifier. So for contractual adjustments on the next slide, there are again three types of these that the government is empowered to make under extraordinary contractual relief. They can make an amendment without consideration, they can correct a mistake, or they can formalize informal commitments. This is generally available only when a defense contractor's productive ability is impaired, or when the government action causes a contractor loss. To make such a request, you need to prepare a packet and you make a request to the contracting officer. Certain certifications are required. It also requires a different type of information than your normal claim. Not only are you going to have to explain why you think you're entitled to the relief and point out any government action that caused the issues, but you're also going to have to explain additional facts that warrant the adjustment. How are you performing on the contract? How is your performance on this contract affecting your ability to perform other important contracts? How is the overall performance of this contract affecting the health of the company? Are you about to go out of business? Are you about to shut down this line? Are you about to quit government contracting? There's also the requirement that it's, whether such relief would facilitate the national defense. I actually think, especially because DOD is kind of has its thumb on the scale and saying we're interested in using this type of authority. I think that argument can easily be tied into a lot of the conversations DOD and the Hill have been having over the past 2, 3, 5 years about about it being necessary to preserve the defense industrial base. And if the company is going to drop out of the defense industrial base, I think that keeping them in the base is consistent with national security interests. Advance payments are also available. If you do go this route, you're also going to have to provide adequate security. that the advance payments, you're not going to go out of business and not perform the work or things like that. And then there's also residual powers on the next slide. This is whatever is necessary and appropriate, and if relief cannot be granted under the other two types of extraordinary contractual relief. This is the authority where DOD is able to include indemnification provisions to protect contractors against certain unusually hazardous conditions. Normally, such indemnification is barred by the Anti-Deficiency Act. That was kind of my thinking in about how it might also work with any kind of funding issues related to EPA clauses. So I think there's maybe a way to mix these two together that's interesting that I need to think about some more. But I think that could be a helpful way if that's a contracting officer's objection. I will say overall, like, extraordinary contractual relief is used sparingly in history, but I think, again, it sounds like a broke record. I think there's a real opportunity here for the right contractors, the right small business contractors in the right situation to use it to gain some relief. Related to all of this, and as I mentioned earlier, DOD has also hinted at, said explicitly, that they really need Congress to help. Actually put a pin in that for a second. We have a question of whether the Department of Energy has issued any guidance on extraordinary contractual relief. Not that I know of, but I can run that down for you. In fact, I don't know of any of the other non-DOD agencies of having issued any more recent guidance on extraordinary contractual relief.
Yeah, Kevin, I haven't seen anything. I agree with you, but we can definitely take a look.
One thing I have, one thing, as I was mentioning before, that DOD has talked about a lot is that it needs Congress and more specifically funding to really address this inflation issue. And I mean, that makes sense. I think largely we're in the same position we were at with relief for COVID-19, where we have guidance that strongly suggests such relief should be available. But the agencies just don't have funding because it's not 1, 2, 10 contractors that are affected. It's literally every contractor, or almost every contractor, is having an issue. Is having an issue with inflation, and that makes it tough to say this contract gets it, that one doesn't, if they don't have the necessary funding. So they've been talking about getting a solution on the Hill. I know we're on the next slide. A lot of government contractor trade associations have similarly been working and lobbying to try and get Congress to address inflation relief as part of ongoing negotiations over the next CR, or as part of the NDAA. I'm not sure how those are currently going, but DOD thinks its efforts to convince Congress are tied to it being able to get some core data about how big a problem this is. So we've kind of outlined what the agencies have said. We've talked a little about what companies should be doing to position themselves, but we wanted to really focus on giving some actionable strategies and advice. So I'll turn this back over to Lauren for how should companies be applying what we've just been rambling about.
Sure. Real quick, it doesn't look like there's a question that somebody asked about how likely is it that DOD will add an EPA clause. We have started trying to negotiate these clauses on behalf of our clients. We're just getting started on these types of negotiations, so we can't really speak to how successfully they will become. But I think the biggest point of contention is really the relationship that the contractor has with the CO. I mean, if there's been discussions about the impact of inflation and the contracting officer is willing to hear what the contractor has to say, and the relationship has been amicable throughout performance, I think it's encouraging, to bring this to their attention, cite to the guidance, and try to negotiate from there. If the CO has just, been a wall this whole time as far as your attempt to negotiate an EPA clause, if you submitted an REA tied to inflation and was immediately denied, those types of instances obviously would not cater to the EPA clause negotiation. So it really is based off of, the contract and then also the relationship that you have with the CO. But I'm going to jump back into the presentation and talk about these price escalation strategies. So we're going to focus first on pre-award strategies. So one of the things that we try to tell our clients is that you obviously want to monitor pricing carefully during the bidding phase. What are your materials looking like? What quotes are the subcontractors providing to you? Is there a big range in pricing? Just getting a good idea of what that's going to look like and what it may look like in the future. Another thing is obviously we want to start thinking about building risk into our proposed prices and documenting that consideration. DOD has come out in their guidance and said that they expect to pay higher prices. We know that, that may not necessarily be the case when, you're submitting a competitive bid, and there's a risk that, a higher price obviously is going to cause you to lose out. So there's a delicate balance there as far as, building the risk, monitoring your pricing, and then putting together a competitive bid. One of the things that we recommend is, seeing if there's a willingness to negotiate an economic price adjustment clause into the contract or some type of contingency to cover price escalations that may be unanticipated. Another thing, like I said before, is reviewing subcontractor and supplier quotes, making sure that there's escalation terms in there. Also limiting the length of time your price bid is valid. The way inflation has increased and so quickly, this is obviously something that needs to be considered as you strategize your bid at the pre-award phase. So moving to post-award strategies. Obviously, we want to check our contract to see if there's already an EPA clause in there. Has there been any changes in the law or tax clauses that may provide us with an appropriate equitable adjustment argument? One of the things that is available to some contractors is that there are SCA wage determination clauses or federal minimum wage clauses built into a contract that allow for these types of negotiations. A lot of our clients have come to us where, subcontractors have backed out from their quotes or, they haven't nailed down a firm fixed price with a subcontractor right away. What we recommend, obviously, at the post-award stage is that you secure those fixed prices with your subcontractors with confirmation in writing that they're going to comply with all obligations, and any impacts to the supply chain are immediately notified to the prime contractor. Another strategy that we propose is accelerating or deferring purchases of materials subject to escalation. Again, it's very dependent on the contract, whether and on the rise of inflation, and so whether or not you want to accelerate or defer, but this is something that you will want to consider once you have that award. The other thing is that we recommend to our clients is that they closely scrutinize any government direction for potential changes or delays. This can come into play significantly if there's a directed change from the government that causes a 60 to 120 day delay. That can cause a significant increase in subcontractor and supplier costs, and also a reduction in available labor. So this is something that everybody needs to be aware of as soon as a government directive comes down the pipe, that, we understand what type of impact that is going to have on our cost points. GSA memo states that compensation is appropriate when a government delay does push work into a period when higher costs are encountered. This is something that, we like to hang our hat on, because it is a way for us to show that this rise in cost is by no fault of the contractor. Rather, it's in the realm of responsibility of the government. So, if you're getting a directive, make sure that you're keeping track of those directives and you're putting the government on direct notice that this is impacting your cost point. Another thing to consider is purchasing supplies early and store on site if necessary. If you think 8 months down the line you're going to be needing to order some equipment, maybe consider ordering it 2 months prior. We have some clients that have run into this issue, and the government really, is not providing any type of relief. So, if you believe that you're going to be able to get these supplies or materials at a lower cost point today, we highly recommend you consider purchasing it and just storing it on site if you can.
Yeah, and with that, I just want to echo the idea of, well, never mind, cover right here.
So just some traps that we are highlighting, and Kevin, feel free to jump in, but inflated fixed price estimates. There is some recent case law out there that contractors can face FDA liability for submitting falsely inflated project estimates. There is a case that we have identified. It's USN4U LLC versus Wolf Creek Federal Services. The citation is 2022 WL 1531966. That actually speaks to the FDA liability regarding inflated estimates. Since we're running short on time, I'll refer you guys to that case to take a look at it, but it's something to keep in mind. Failing to take all possible steps to secure pricing. This just builds into what I identified in the last slide as far as nailing down subcontractor quotes, and understanding and monitoring pricing on a daily basis if you can. Also, a reasonableness of cost under cost type contracts. The government can challenge the reasonableness of cost because a contractor waited too long to secure subcontractor pricing. So again, this builds into this idea that we want to have open conversations with our subcontractors as early on as possible in performance to make sure that we understand that there's escalations built in, and that we're getting the best price that we can possibly get. We're seeking alternative quotes if necessary. So these are all traps that we need to consider as we move forward under these economic times.
So now I think, Lauren, just to skip ahead, we're basically out of time, but we had a couple questions. So why don't we leave this screen up and answer some of these questions. There's some comments about how contractors don't always get to determine the length of time that their bids are valid for. And that's true. A lot of times the solicitation will set the requirement. A lot of times, however, you do get an option when you have changes or you're working on different types of cost proposals while you're performing, or even when you submit bids. A lot of times the government will ask you for extensions or how long an extension are you willing to keep the bid open for. And those are real considerations that you should have about how long you're willing to do that in situations where you do get that choice. There is also a question, how likely is DOD to add to an EPA clause to a contract that was awarded competitively? Actually, Lauren addressed that. The same commenter, however, had a question, how can we make the national security argument to apply extraordinary contractual relief when there are other companies in the same marketplace? The whole idea of the discussions that have been going on in the Hill with regard to a robust defense industrial base is that it is dangerous if there are only one or two suppliers of a particular good or service, and that the defense industrial base becomes overly reliant on a single entity. You have those monopolistic issues where they get to set price and maybe you drive up price, or their lack of competition is going to reduce the amount of ingenuity and customer service. But it also creates a single point of failure. If China or Russia were to infiltrate a single company, or a cyber attack was to take out a single company, then DOD would have no way to get X product. So even with multiple companies in the same marketplace, I think there's the argument that if one is going to go out of business, it is going to reduce the defense industrial base and therefore harm national security. And again, this isn't just me talking about academic pie in the sky ideas. These are the conversations that have been going on. They're reflected in numbers of provisions in the past, 4 or 5 NDAs. So I think it's a well supportable argument. After that brief impression of the Micro Machines guy, I am officially out of time. And so thank you everyone for joining us. And feel free to follow up with Lauren or I if you have any questions about inflation, about your contract, and about how we can get any kinds of remedies. I want to thank everyone who asked questions. They were all great questions that really helped move the dialogue along. And we appreciate you joining today.
Thank you, everyone.